Hi, Ray Dickey from Association Help Now. Thank you so much for joining us. Real quick, I want to say hi to Dave. How are you, Dave?
Hey, how you doing?
So before we get started, and there's a lot to talk about today, I want to tell you how to ask questions. So everyone should have a panel, and you should have something that says questions. It may say chat. If you ask me questions through there, I will either relay the questions to Dave, or I may ask you to ask them yourself. And I think what we're going to do today is try to get through a lot of the talking points first. Is that okay, Dave?
Sure.
And then maybe what we'll do is go ahead and go to the Q&A. There's a couple handouts. There's a couple handouts today for everybody. There's one that's called May 2020. It's this one that Dave provided. If you're interested in it, it has a lot of the provisions in regard to Radburn. There's also one that I included, which were the proposals from the New Jersey State site. And then there's a flyer about our event this Thursday. Okay, Dave, why don't we just go right through the list of.
Yeah, I thought that sort of the first thing I would say is, I mean, there's so many things to talk about, but one of the themes I thought with these regulations, the DCA adopted regulations that it contends are necessary to allow people to comply with what we call the Radburn Amendments. And so, well, when I look at the regulations, I see a bunch of different things. And one of the things I see is an attempt by DCA to try to deal with the way that lawyers and managers have been complying with the statutes for these past 20, 30 some odd years, but still providing good practical governance. And an example of that is there's always been a requirement that a board's binding decisions be made at a meeting that's open to attendance of owners. And there's some exceptions, but everybody knows that when you make that boards make binding decisions all the time. A board may decide between board meetings to make a repair to a sidewalk, or allocate, spend $50 on a party that's going to take place in the lobby. Technically, all those are binding decisions. And with the way professionals, whether the lawyers or managers and the like, have always sort of dealt with that, has been to allow boards to make decisions through email or through informal ways, and then have that decision ratified at the next board meeting open to attendance of owners. And the reason that worked is because previously the statutes simply required decisions to be made at a meeting open to attendance of owners, but it didn't provide any mechanism for the owners to do anything. So there was no practical reason why a board couldn't make a decision first and then ratify it later with the decision taking effect in the interim time, because the owners weren't going to be able to do anything about it anyway. And that was where we logically had practical governance, by allowing boards to make decisions throughout the course of a year that were binding, but yet were not made at a quote unquote meeting open to attendance of owners. These regulations, however, have attempted to completely undo that. Sort of, I guess the DCA recognized that was a mechanism by which boards were making decisions, and the DCA has attempted to make regulations that have essentially, or at least have purported to be, used to wipe out the ability of a board to make any decisions unless they're made initially at a meeting open to attendance of owners, because the DCA defines a binding decision as every decision, and nothing is binding until it's done at a meeting of the board open to attendance of owners. So therefore, the ratification concept has been lost if these regulations turn out to be enforceable, constitutional, or whatever the case may be.
Well, let's start off with that then, Dave. Does that include decisions that are made in regard to things that are litigation or contracts?
The attempt with this language is, the answer is yes. The DCA has attempted to create a mechanism where a board can have discussions about things, litigation, contract negotiations, discipline or removal of officers, unwarranted invasion of privacy. There are buckets of topics that the DCA has now attempted to claim can be discussed at a meeting or gathering that's not open to attendance of owners. But ultimately, the binding decision that you want to take from that would have to be made at a board meeting open to attendance of owners in such a way as to protect the confidentiality or the attorney-client privilege communication that you had in the closed meeting. So yeah, the intent of these regulations, as I see it, is to remove the possibility of a board ever making any decision in any way other than at a meeting that's open to attendance of owners.
What about if it's a decision that's very timely, or it's an emergency, something with a roof, there's a contract, or where does that leave boards?
The regulations provide for the board to have an immediate emergency meeting that involves some urgent or important thing, and the notice can be immediate. But there's still no, the need to have an immediate urgent decision is not an excuse to make the binding decision in private and then ratify it later. It's simply an excuse to have the board meeting open with less notice. Because right now, we'll talk about this I'm sure later, but right now there's a 7-day notice requirement for board meetings, which is totally different than what it's been in the past. And it requires personal notice and all kinds of things like that. So the emergency concept would simply allow the board to have the open meeting without all that notice, but you still would have to have the meeting. It wouldn't be that you could have a private decision made because the house is on fire and then ratify it, 3 weeks later at a board meeting.
Do the owners have any new leeway or rights in regard to the decisions that are made? Do they have an influence on these decisions?
No, there's still no mechanism by which the owners can participate. The portions of the relevant statutes that contemplate or govern the board meeting open to attendance of owners. I try to avoid the use of open meetings, that term, because it oftentimes is confusing and mixes people up when they're thinking about owners meetings. Because the concept of the owners meeting is always the meeting where there's this big open thing and everyone comes in and there are questions and reports and all kinds of stuff. The board meeting is not required to be like that. So when I talk about board meetings, I try to, again, use the expression board meeting open to attendance of owners. It's not a quote unquote open meeting because people interpret that as a variety of different things. So the regulations don't create a new right on the part of the owners that are present at the board meeting. The board can still allow them to talk or still preclude them from talking. So the owner's rights are going to still be after the fact because there are minutes requirements and things like that. So no, I don't believe any of that's changed, which is arguably a reason why the change to begin with wasn't really, that necessary.
If a board needs to put something together pretty quickly, can they do electronic meeting or do they have to be in person?
No, there has to be a meeting because the owners have to be able to attend. All owners have to be able to attend. So I don't know how you would do that otherwise. I mean, how would you?
Sorry, I was talking in regard to a board having an open meeting electronically, either through something that we're using right now, where people can still offer input, which a lot of boards have been doing because of coronavirus, compared to actually physically. Because here's my next question. You know what it's going to be, right? The DCA put this requirement in, but we're also dealing with a situation right now with coronavirus.
Well, yeah, this coronavirus thing may be a mechanism by which we can, as a community association group, delay our reliance on these regulations or argue that they're not necessarily yet applicable. But the regulations require the board to have a meeting open to attendance of owners at a specific place that everyone can attend. I'm not aware of any mechanism by which you can guarantee that every owner is available to participate in a Zoom conference. I mean, I don't know how you could justify that.
All right, let's bounce around a lot with a lot of these amendments, and let me see if there's a question related to what we just spoke about here. Here's a question from Carolee. So boards that are required by governing documents to have only 1 to 2 open meetings a year are now going to be forced to have many more formal meetings per year?
Yes, I mean, if you're intending to comply with the strict letter of these regulations, it would be hard to imagine a scenario whereby a board could get by with only 1 or 2 board meetings that are open to attendance of owners. Now, if you're in a different type of, I mean, look, this may just force, in some ways, force associations to be more proactive. So if you only want to have 2 board meetings that are open to attendance of owners during the course of a year, make all of your binding decisions at one time. Adopt your budget and allow your management company to carry out all the activities that are consistent with the budget. You can, there are ways, I'm still sort of kind of coming up with some strategies and the like, but I think there are ways that a community, especially that doesn't want to have a board meeting every 3 days or every week or every month, can still effectively comply with the regulations, but it's going to require a lot of planning and strategy, and it's just less laziness about getting things done. And that relates as well to the penalty provision, which we can talk about later. Now, the regulations do create some, a new concept which might be useful to boards. That there's a section in the regulations now. The board is empowered to, by majority vote, remove another board member. And that's traditionally, and again, traditionally your documents allowed boards to allow a community to remove a board member only upon a vote of the owners, right? And so boards were stuck with the board member who maybe didn't show up, who was difficult, who was punitive against owners that didn't like him, may have engaged in somewhat discriminatory practices, may have been under a cloud of suspicion for contractor, improper relationships with contractors, and boards were kind of stuck as to how to deal with that, because owners, even just getting the owner vote in place is just a lot of work. So that wasn't really going to work. This new regulation allows the board, majority of the board, to deal with that by having a vote of the board. Now, if the board wants to remove a board member because of a simple disagreement with the board members, like I don't agree with you, or because they breached some confidentiality agreement, which many associations use, and up until now there was always a question of whether or not they were lawful. But if the board wants to do that, it could now do that, unless the removal is for a different type of thing, confidentiality agreement breach, or a disagreement. But one quick thing, like for an example, let's say you have let's say my dog's making a lot of noise. Let's say we have an election where there were. This might not necessarily apply now because of other regulations, but let's say there was a concept where there were ballots cast, and the election rules provided for the fact that the votes of people were supposed to be not disclosed to everybody, so that you wouldn't know necessarily who your neighbor voted for. Okay. If a board member finds that information out and then revealed it to other people, that might be grounds for the board to remove them.
I want to try to take a couple steps back, Dave, because people actually still have quite a few questions that relate to the meetings, and then we'll go back into the election and removing a board member. John's asking what type of, and this is, once again, these questions are in regard to the meetings, and I have a lot here. I'm not going to read them all. What type of matters can be discussed and acted upon if the community was not given notice to attend the meeting if they choose to?
Well, there's a reason why lawyers object to compound questions, because that's compound question, and it's important because the word discuss is different from the word decide or act upon. Board can discuss anything at any time for any reason in any forum, but the regulations make it clear that the board can make a binding decision with respect to nothing unless it's done in the context of an open meeting, of a meeting open to attendance of owners. I don't know if that answers the question, but you really do have to differentiate between the decision and the discussion. There's no prohibition against board members sending emails around all weekend about a particular topic. This isn't like a public, the town council, where there are rules, I think, about how government officials can communicate and when they can meet. It has nothing to do with that. So board members can talk about anything they want anytime they want to talk about things, and they can have the topic be whatever they want the topic to be, but that's different from the decision aspect of it.
And a lot of questions about coronavirus. We already kind of touched upon that. Boards are, this is from Richard, boards are using workshops to bypass holding a board meeting. they are being advised by their attorneys that this is allowed. Also to delay the annual meeting as well.
I think the first part is I think their lawyers are correct, and that's the advice that I've given. And as I said when I first started, that advice is advice that has been in play for 20, 30 some odd years. The advice being boards make decisions at workshops or executive, whatever term we've come to call these things, workshops, executive sessions, all these things, emails on a Saturday night. Boards have been making decisions for years and then ratifying those decisions at an open meeting, at a board meeting that's open to attendance of owners later. And that these regulations are written to preclude that.
A couple people commented that you may have used the word if you are planning to comply with these regs.
Well, I see my role, hold on. The dog rules a lot of times. All right, so I see my role in a lot of ways is not as being, giving associations what the rule is, what the regulation is, talk about how it is to be carried out, how it relates to what you've been doing in the, up till now. But then also talking as a lawyer as to what strategies are available to argue that you don't have to comply, or what strategies are available to interpret the regulation differently. I mean, that's what lawyers are for. That's what, that's what I think in a lot of ways what lawyers are for. There's an argument that some of these regulations are not constitutional. There's an argument that some of them, that the DCA never had the power to make regulations. We learned, many of us, I hope, learned in school the way government works. The legislature is the group of people that people vote for, and they make laws. And people that work in DCA are people that are hired by the government. We don't vote for them, and they're not necessarily allowed to make laws for us. The legislature is allowed to make laws. And these regulations were made by people that were hired by the government to work in the DCA. They might be fine people. The point is they're not elected by us. And there is a limitation as to what people that aren't elected are allowed to do. So in my mind, it is entirely conceivable, if not completely appropriate, to take the position as an association that, wait a minute, this section is not consistent with the law. The law says this, and this regulation says that, and therefore we're choosing to not comply with that. I mean, a board can choose to not take that position, but I feel that it'd be our role and professional management's role and the leaders in the industry, our role is to give boards the sort of the wealth of knowledge about these things and try to come up with strategies as to how to deal with them.
Couple questions. There's a little bit of confusion. What is discussed at the board meetings hasn't changed. You're still going to keep legal issues, collection issues confidential. You're just going to vote on the decision, correct? The board vote.
Right. When you say board meeting, remember, this is really important. People call, there is a different type of board meeting. A lot of people say I'm having a board meeting, but like you said, they get together on Zoom and the board members talk about stuff. That's a board meeting, but it's not a board meeting that's contemplated by the law. It's like a board gathering. It's like a cocktail party. Technically, nothing's really supposed to come of it. So the board meeting that's open to attendance of owners is what is involved here and what drives the train, and that governs when binding decisions can be made, and a board can have discussions about anything that wants in private or at a meeting that is open to attendance of owners. I don't know if that answers the question, but I'm trying not to be confusing, but I think you should start from the premise that these regulations, if they're enforceable, are written to, I think, and designed to preclude a board from making any decision at any time for any reason, unless it's made for the first time at a board meeting that's open to attendance of owners. Now, if you want to try to strategize how to get around with that, I think that's great. But I think the intent of the regulation is what I just described it to be.
I'm going to do 2 more questions in regard to these meetings, and then we're going to have to move on. And people could stay for a Q&A afterwards. We always go to overtime. Dave said he's available to stand by, so you can always catch up with your questions then. If an annual budget, this is from Stephen, if an annual budget is approved and an expense item that is budgeted must be purchased, like a replacement item, Is a board meeting attended by the owners required to approve that purchase?
That is a great question and relates in some ways to what I said a second ago, or at least in passing, where the proactive board might be able to deal with these things more easily by deciding what in fact is a binding decision. If I adopt a budget, I give you a perfect example, this goes to the question. You hire a management company, you sign a contract, you're required to pay your management company X dollars every month, okay? Your budget contemplates the payment of the management company. It seems ludicrous to suggest the board has to have a meeting to authorize the check to be sent to the management company. The binding decision, in my mind, could very well be the budget. And as long as expenditures and decisions are made consistent with the budget, the only binding decision that was necessary was the budget. And I think that should answer the question.
John's question is, are decisions or actions by the management company, in this case, consistent with the budget, exempt from these regulations? And you can make that question broader. What about management company decisions?
Well, yeah, I think that just my last response, I think, was trying to cover that, which is that in my mind, I don't know what the DCA thinks about that. The DCA may believe that every single decision, every single thing you do requires a binding decision, whether it's mopping the floor in a different way than you mopped it the day before. But in my mind, okay, I think a very strong argument exists that anything an association does, whether it's through the board, through the concierge, through the management company, that is consistent with the budget that was adopted by the board as a binding decision at a board meeting open to attendance of owners, does not require another binding decision. It's the binding decision was the first, but that's an argument I make. But the point of these things are, and then I'm sure people who are working with other attorneys will definitely need to speak with them because they may have some other ideas. But my view is that that's certainly an argument that I'd be comfortable making, and I think we'd win. But I can tell you that the DCA guys are probably going to disagree with that. Otherwise, why would they write this?
So there's a back, and if anybody has any more questions about the meetings, you can ask afterwards. So I want to get to some of these other items here. Dave, back to the removing a board member. I mean, I have a long list of questions here of different circumstances where board members obviously see this as a way to get rid of, somebody that's been a pain in the neck for a long time. I'm just going to ask one of these, and maybe you could re-clarify the comments again. Can a board member remove a fellow trustee if that member is accusing a board member of illegal policy and procedures on social media? Just real quick, what are the guidelines?
I don't know, because every situation is different, but there are a couple comments. First is the regulation prohibits the removal of a board member for disagreeing with the other board members or for violating some confidentiality agreement, unless the removal is approved by some independent ADR group, which you'd have to pay for. I mean, it'd be kind of a pain. So removing a board member who accuses other board members of being shady on social media, I mean, that's probably not a good cause removal that is something other than just disagreeing with your fellow board members. So I would think that, I can tell you the DCA won't agree. My view is the DCA would never agree that would be appropriate. I think the good cause removal, I think the language is good cause directly impacting the member's ability to serve, something like that. That would be, a member having taken kickbacks, or a board member having stolen, or a board member having, gone to the pool and ordered a certain, race of people to leave, that kind of nonsense. I think that's the kind of thing that I think the regulation is designed to empower a board to deal with, because that's the kind of board member that's likely a bad person. And that's not the same thing as just a honest disagreement over what board member is smart and doing the right thing and that sort of thing. But no matter what, based on these regulations, the board's decision to remove the board member would have to be made at a board meeting that's open to attendance of owners, which is a whole nother limitation, because if the guy who is going, or the lady who's going to be removed, will have to have notice of this and they could invite their friends to come, and it could be a big, round robin cage match, wrestling cage match at that point. So I think it'd have to go on a case by case basis, but it's out there. It's something different that hasn't been there before, and is designed, I think, to help boards deal with the board member who is really a bad person and has done some bad things, or you think is going to do some really bad things, but you're stuck with the person because the owners are not going to remove him or her.
So I have so many questions here about so many things, so I apologize to everybody. Some of these are going to have to wait until the end, or we're never going to get to at least a broad discussion.
That's Ray's way of telling me that I need to make my answers shorter. Okay.
No, you're doing great. There's so many questions here. Let's talk about 51% of the owners to initiate the removal of a board member.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the regulations. Yeah, the regulations now have the new regulations have a provision that I think is one of those things which is sort of notwithstanding whatever your bylaws say. 51% of all owners have the ability to initiate a process to remove a board member, or multiple board members, I suppose. So 51% of the owners submit a petition. We all are in favor of the removal of X person. Then that association is obligated then to have what the regulations call a special election, at which point the removal of that board member will be put before the membership. And the regulations have very specific requirements about that even. What the notice has to say, you have to send a ballot out with the notice. Again, going back to my very first point, these regulations, I think in a lot of ways are designed to deal with the ways in which lawyers and managers and other professionals have created a way to handle association governance in such a practical and efficient way that may frustrate some people. So owners might submit a petition to remove a board member, but the bylaws don't require the board, don't put a time limit on when the board has to have the vote. They don't require the board to send a ballot out for the removal. So essentially, the board can get a petition, have a removal meeting 6 months later, and it requires 2/3 vote, and you don't send a ballot, which means the only way you get 2/3 vote is if 2/3 of the people show up physically. So it's very difficult to remove a board member. And it was legal, in my mind, to create a mechanism that would make it difficult to remove a board member. And that's what we all have done. These regulations are designed to make it a lot easier to remove a board member.
Provide that only owners may fill a vacancy on the board.
Yeah, I think there's I think a couple people have read that section, I think different ways. I think that the way it's supposed to be read is that it's still, a board is still allowed to fill a vacancy if it's created by virtue of resignation, removal, death, disqualification, like good standing, but that the replacement has to be the subject of an election within a year after. So many of our governing documents have provisions that allow a board to replace a vacant seat, and that person who's appointed serves the remainder of the term, 2 years, 3 years, whatever the case may be. This regulation is set up so that the board can replace the person who has resigned or has become disqualified because they didn't pay assessments, but that replacement has to be the subject of an election within a year.
That's a big change for a lot of boards because sometimes, people resign pretty quickly. People are commenting, they're noticing a lot of language about 50 units, over 50 units, or under 50 units.
Right. That's actually, well, there's a variety of different unfortunate aspects to these regulations, but I thought that was a particularly unfortunate part because, although in some ways I think it might support the argument that the regulations are illegal. The statute created the Radburn Amendments. These amendments created a different playing field for the smaller association and the larger association. And the smaller association, 50 or under 50 units, had more leeway, more flexibility to create certain mechanisms, certain ways to govern themselves. And associations with 50 plus units, there were more requirements. The regulations, though, impose requirements on associations that are under 50 units and over 50 units. the under 50 unit associations still have flexibility, but they don't have as much flexibility as they did before these regulations. And so, yeah, the regulations, I think in some ways are, have operated to sort of blur the distinction between the large and the smaller associations, which is unfortunate because the small associations, have a more difficult time, paying lawyers and paying, professional management to run all this stuff. A lot of the 30 unit, 40 unit associations are run by just regular people who don't have time to read, 60,000 pages worth of, DCA regulations.
Empower the DCA to enforce, including the use of a monetary penalty. That doesn't sound
right. Never sounds good when a government can enforce its own rules, right? So up until now, and many of you guys who are listening or watching may have had this experience. An owner doesn't like, says that they didn't have access to the minutes or something like that. And they write a letter to the DCA. And the DCA then writes a nasty letter back demanding all kinds of things. You've been accused of failing to do X, Y, Z. Please explain yourself. Well, my view is, and obviously I guess I was right because otherwise the regulations wouldn't have been adopted, but my advice has always been those are basically worthless. The government has no power to do anything. It's basically requesting that you voluntarily engage in some back and forth with the DCA. And so you could basically write a letter back which says, thank you for your comment. I assure you that the association is complying with all the rules. Have a nice day. And the government really couldn't do much more about it. The regulations now change that. They empower the DCA to accept complaints and then actually bring administrative actions to enforce. So in this way, it will be more, it'll be more familiar in that it will feel and exist like what happens with the DCA and the inspections. They come out, they inspect, they then issue a report and a violation. And then you can appeal that violation. You don't have to automatically pay or automatically comply. You can appeal it. And then there's a hearing, and you win, you lose, you settle. These new regulations now have created a mechanism whereby the DCA can actually enforce all these things. So an owner can write a letter to the DCA and say, I found out the board made a decision X, and they didn't make it at a board meeting open to intensive owners. And instead of writing a nasty letter that the DCA could do in the past and you could ignore it, now the DCA can actually initiate a investigation, bring an action against you as an association, which you would then have to oppose, and challenge and conceivably have a trial in administrative law. And if you're guilty, then the association could be subject to penalties. So that's different. That basically is, a fundamental change, allowing the DCA reserve to itself the ability to punish you for regulations that it may not have the right to adopt in the first place.
Sounds like more work for lawyers on that.
Yeah, when a colleague of mine in the industry said to me after he read these that this is like a omnibus stimulus bill for New Jersey condo lawyers. So it's a shame, but it is.
What about this binding definition of good standing? Is that going to, and if that dumps us into a whole election thing, maybe we'll push that back towards the end. There's a lot of election questions, but go ahead.
Yeah, I think the good thing, the positive thing was the Radburn Amendments did create a clear delineation or definition of what good standing meant, at least in the context of elections, not necessarily for other things like using the pool or something like that. But the Radburn Amendments did create a definition for good standing, what it meant, and there was no really ambiguity as to what it was going to mean. In the past, it was, well, if you owe late fees only, are you in good standing? Well, the Radburn Amendments answered that question, no, you're not in good standing. The DCA's regulations basically took that and cemented it even further and making it clear that the DCA visualizes the Radburn Amendments vis-a-vis good standing the same way most people who are in this industry do. So it makes it a lot clearer. It's more reliable. I think we can pretty much rely on the fact that the DCA agrees with how all of us, I think, have been interpreting that good standing provision.
And we're going to go back to elections. There's a lot of questions about elections. There's actually a lot of amendments in regard to elections. Let me just get through a couple of these other ones. Every association must have an annual meeting. I mean, it's on my list here, but.
Yeah. Again, that is a very crafty DCA attempt to deal with advice that lawyers and professional management and other people in the industry have been giving for a long time. Annual meetings are different than elections. I mean, the Radburn Amendments, in fact, treat them incredibly different. Elections are different than annual meetings. An annual meeting without an election is arguably not a meeting at all. It's really an information session, because if the owners aren't voting on something, then nothing really happens. So if you have an election and then you have an annual meeting, the annual meeting is, I mean, there's no vote, nothing legal is going to result from it. And so I think a lot of associations, again, in furtherance of sort of good and efficient government, especially once we started to develop ballots by mail, elections by mail, elections by electronic means, had basically said, well, you know, the annual meetings for an election. If we're going to have an election by mail or an election through electronic means, why am I now having an annual meeting? So my secretary can stand up and read a report about, you know, the number of parties we had in the past year. I mean, if that's like an informational session, which may be appropriate, but there's no legal significance to it. This regulation mandates that you have an annual meeting, regardless of what you do at it. And it's a trigger for an obligation for the board to schedule all of its meetings for the next 12 months and then give notice of them. And it's a pretty big imposition on how associations have been running their communities up until now.
In regard to, there's a question here from Deanna. I just lost it here. Hold on a second. Actually, Jacqueline, every ballot is confidential and cast anonymously, but it needs to be open to inspection to any member. That was one of the amendments. How is that going to work, Dave?
That's a very good. That's a very good point. Very good question, and it's going to work if you are going to strictly comply with it. It's going to work by virtue of creating a second layer. You know, I was thinking about this morning. You know, iPhones or some of the smartphones have the double layer of I forget what they call it. They have like a double layer of security. This is kind of what this is. So the ballot itself has to be anonymous. So it will have the votes cast, you know, who I'm voting for, but it will not have my name or address. That way, when people look at them, I suppose, at a meeting where everyone's standing around watching, they won't know who the vote is. Okay, I mean, they'll basically know whether a counter is throwing out a ballot or lying about the content, but the ballot itself will still be anonymous. They won't be able to connect it back. So what the board then has to do to make sure that people aren't voting more than once, or to make sure people aren't voting they're delinquent, is they'll have to create a mechanism where every ballot can be traced back to the voter. So every ballot will have a number on it, as opposed to a name. And then there'll be a chart somewhere. So every ballot will have, you have an association of 100 units, every ballot will have a number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, something like that. And then there'll be a master chart somewhere else, perhaps held by the inspectors or the managers, someone who's qualified the votes. There will be a name, and next to it will be 1, 2, 3, 4. So the ballot itself won't allow you to know who voted. You'd have to go to the chart, and you have to connect that with the ballot. That's, I think, how it's going to have to work, which is a mechanism, a way in which the most associations have just not been doing these things, which this is a lot more work, obviously.
Who's going to decide who has access to who actually placed the ballots? And is it absolutely set in stone that residents are not entitled to that information? Because it's still somewhere.
No, they're entitled to. In fact, the regulations specifically empower an owner to look at the ballots
Anonymously.
Right, the ballots. It says the ballot. It says ballots. It doesn't say the material by which the association decided whether they're qualified. But an owner probably has the right to review all that anyway, but just under a different law. But under these regulations, it's limited to a ballot. 90 days from the election, I think it is, every owner has the right to look at the ballots then that, so it's like a threshold kind of thing, because if you can't necessarily, if there's been fraud or malfeasance in the election, the malfeasance might come at the registration part, or may come through the qualification part, but it also could come in the fact that people throw ballots in the garbage when they're counting them, or they pretend they didn't see a ballot that they really saw. So this would protect against at least that fraud, because theoretically every ballot is opened in front of everybody, and then those ballots are retained for 90 days or perhaps longer. So a board could not say that trustee X got 100 votes because they just ignored a couple in the pile, when in fact he only got 95, because there's only 95 in the pile. Somebody would see it. They'd know that the count was bad. They wouldn't know who voted. They would know the count is bad.
So the boards are certifying whether or not a ballot is accurate after they open it up in front of the owners?
No, well, there's a way. No, there's a way to manage that as well, because the envelope itself could have the envelope could have also have the number. No, some associations already do this. They already have this. They already try to have elections that are more akin to our public elections, where someone shows up to vote. They're theoretically qualified to vote, although it depends on what state you're in as to how hard that actually is. And then you don't get in the voting booth unless you, I guess in some ways, are supposed to be there. But your vote itself is secret in the voting booth, okay? This is designed to kind of be like that. There's still a mechanism for you to trace it back, but the actual ballot is supposed to be anonymous. So if they come in envelopes, you have to have a way in which the envelope can be tied to an owner. And you can do that by numbers, by codes, colors, all kinds of things.
So then you don't present that envelope at the meeting when you tally the votes. There's still a pile of ballots sitting somewhere that are not qualified.
No, I'd have to look at the regulations more specifically when it gets down to that, but I think that the regulations talk about having like a box, having like a secured location where the ballots go. I think the spirit of the regulations, the spirit is that ballots come in envelopes, they stay in envelopes. Right. Otherwise, they could be destroyed and you'd have no idea they even showed up.
Right, and this is my last question about this. So if the envelope is from John Doe and John Doe is not in good standing,
then you'd move the ballot would not be counted. It wouldn't go on the table in front of 50 people that are watching you count.
Right, and those ballots are not required to be in front of the residents.
Correct. They would have to be retained in some record keeping process, but that's not different than it already has been. I mean, associations are really supposed to be keeping those disqualified ballots anyway in some form, because someone could always challenge later that they were wrongly disqualified.
Let's talk about every owner is entitled to an individual notice of a board meeting open to the attendance of owners.
Correct. Yeah, well, up until now, the board meeting open to attendance of owners, the only notice of it to owners, it had to be adequate, but the DCA's regulation was that adequate meant posting it in the newspaper and publishing it in the newspaper, or two newspapers. I think two newspapers even exist anymore, but publishing in two newspapers and then posting it somewhere prominently in the community. That was the adequate notice. So you could have a board meeting that you plan to have open to attendance of owners, at which you plan to make binding decisions. And the only way an owner would know about it is if they happen to read the newspaper, or they happen to be walking by the area where it was posted. And a high-rise condo or a community like that, it's possible that most people would see the notice on the board, I guess. But in other types of associations, it's entirely possible an owner would never even know. And so these regulations are now replacing that and have defined adequate notice as something far more massive and controlled. Notice individual people, hand delivery, mail, or electronic. website if you have one, newsletter if you have one, still posting it at a prominent location in the neighborhood. And they removed, which I guess probably makes a lot of sense, they removed the newspaper requirement. So now you can't have a board meeting open to intensive owners where you plan to make binding decisions after giving notice through the newspaper and through putting it on a wall with pretty much the understanding that no one will ever see it. So now that's not really an option. Now you should assume that every time you're going to have a board meeting that you plan to, at which point you plan to make a binding decision, you're probably going to have a variety of owners that know, that actually, in fact, know, the meeting's taking place. So
a couple other talking points here on my list, and then we're going to jump into the Q&A, and there's a lot of questions. And I'm going to have the audience go ahead and ask the question. A lot of collection questions. Real quick, before I forget to do this, Dave's firm, which I forgot to introduce because we do so many events together, Ansel, Grimm, and Aaron, is giving away, I think, 4 gift cards for $25 a piece. All you need to do is email Dave, and I just sent that to chat to everyone. So find your chat box. You should be able to find Dave's email address and just say, I want a prize. I want $25 in the subject line, and email that to Dave. And Dave's office will probably go through them and do a random selection, I'm sure. Additionally, if you, because we get questions about this all the time, Association Help Now New Jersey books, Dave is still willing to send them to anybody who would like them as long as he has them. Once again, email Dave, and I'll send his email address out by itself, or email me, whatever you want, and we will make sure that you get a book.
Although if the regulations are in fact lawful and constitutional, the book has to be changed.
You're going to have to do it up. You're absolutely right. So we're going to have to get started on that because Dave's a source in that book. So we're probably going to have some of those chapters rewritten. Good point, Dave.
Thanks.
A couple more talking points here, so I make sure we hit them. Every board member to be provided equal opportunity to participate in any board meeting. We're talking board members here. What is that?
Yeah, that's like the height of nanny state regulation. I mean, I don't even know. Some board member somewhere in New Jersey must have written a whiny letter about how he or she's not allowed to talk as much as they want at a board meeting because the board president isn't nice to her person and says, okay, that's enough, move on. That regulation probably comes from something silly like that. I don't even know how you'd quantify whether a board member is given equal opportunity to participate. I don't even know what that means. Participate, vote, talk, read things. I mean, I wouldn't even know how to carry that out or how the DCA would even begin to enforce that. But yeah, that is actually now part of the regulations.
Strict mandates concerning board meeting minutes.
Right. Well, yeah, that's a new one as well. And again, that connects to what I said earlier, which is DCA's really worked hard to try to attack all of the sort of more flexible aspects of community governance. And we've also talked about what have to be in meetings. Boards often ask that question. What have to be in meetings? What have to be in minutes? And there really isn't much of a requirement at all. I mean, I think most advice that I've heard from lawyers, most of it has been, minutes are really supposed to do nothing other than reflect decisions that are made by the board. You can have all kinds of stuff in there. You can put a transcript of owner X said this, owner Y said that. All that's lawful, but the basic requirements were pretty much nothing other than the decisions that were made, which I think was good advice. These regulations, though, now require a lot of more specific things. You have to list who was there. You have to have specific vote identifications, not necessarily the vote result, but how the vote was achieved. And then I think in a more burdensome regulation, the board has to articulate the basis for the decision, the cost of the decision, and that has to be both done at the meeting where owners are allowed to attend, where the binding decision gets made, and it has to be reflected in the minutes as well. And that's a pretty fundamental change from what's been a requirement in the past. And the other thing, about that too, Ray, is there's always been a debate amongst people, among us, about whether or not minutes can be made available to owners before the next meeting, because, our good governance practices have always been that you go to the next meeting and one of the first items on the agenda is to review the minutes, right? And then have a motion to accept the minutes or reject them. This regulation specifically attacks that and expressly says that these minutes have to be made available before the next meeting. And if you want to stamp draft on them, you're free to put draft on them, but you can no longer take the position that minutes aren't minutes until the board ratifies them. The DCA regulations say they got to be available before the next meeting. In fact, they got to be available pretty quickly. And if you want to take a draft, you can, but they still have to be available.
And Dave, I think we spoke about, we're going to try to break some of these issues into short videos also, and you're going to get some information out to people as time allows it, if we can make it happen. So much going on with these. The last talking point, and then a lot of questions. Developer could utilize units if elected to rent as regular votes. Maybe I'm asking it wrong.
No, you're asking it right. This is probably this is of utility only to associations that might be quote unquote in transition. But the way it's always worked is the developer gets a seat on the board as long as they're selling units in the ordinary course. Okay. Sometimes a community, let's say a community has 100 units and 20 of them are unsold, but they're all being rented by the developer. Okay. This regulation would mean that the developer doesn't get a seat on the board because they're rented. But yet that's, in my mind, actually a negative for an association, because it's better for the developer to be seen as a developer, have a guaranteed seat on the board, as opposed to being a unit owner with 20 votes. Because if a developer is no longer a developer and they're renting the 20 units in my example, they now have 20 votes. So in a community where the quorum is 20%, this one developer, who is no longer quote unquote a developer, but essentially is, this now owner is now pretty much able to have an owner's meeting on his own, on her own, able to pretty much probably remove, anytime there's a community with a lot of apathetic people, converting a developer into an owner because he's renting is going to make things more difficult for the non-developer owners. But again, that's a nuanced issue and should be of concern to only managers or board members that are connected with an association that is still in transition, and probably in transition that is slow selling, where units have stopped selling. In an association where you're in transition but the units continue to sell quickly, the issue, whether the units get rented or not, is probably not going to be much of an issue.
So a lot of these questions are actually really great stuff. So let's start going through them all. Dave, I do believe we hit most of the talking points that I had listed in the email. Okay. But there's a lot of questions here. Obviously, a lot of stuff that was missed. I'm going to read some of them. Some of them I'm going to go to the audience. I'm going to read this one from Harold. As far as collections, voting on foreclosures, and discussing that openly, you still don't discuss that at the open board meeting, right, Dave?
Well, I mean, you can. I mean, the board can discuss anything it wants at a board meeting. There's, that's up to the board. There's no like legal requirement that a board not talk about foreclosing on someone at a board meeting. It's generally not done. The bigger question would be, when the board votes to foreclose on someone, does the vote have to be taken at a board meeting over to attendance of owners? Because up until now, it's pretty much been universally understood, or at least argued, that the board would decide to foreclose on someone at a executive session or a work session, or by email, or by lawyer talking to the board president, sort of mechanism by which things keep moving in an association. And now the question would be, well, if the board's making a binding decision to foreclose on someone, do we really have to have a board meeting open to attendance of owners? And do I have to decide to vote on unit 4 in front of 50 people that are sitting there? I mean, the DCA probably says yes, but I mean, I've been thinking about a lot of strategies to deal with that particular problem. But yeah, a strict reading of the regulation would require that.
That seems like a big one.
Yeah, it's a potential problem.
I'm going to go to Ken P. Ken P, you have a question about resolutions. Are you there?
Yeah, I thank you for all the information you're providing, by the way. I'm a little confused when a resolution is necessary to be voted upon at a board meeting, as opposed to the board making voting in public for the first time and making a decision on something. How do you differentiate between one and the other, if you do?
Good question. And I think the answer is there's really no differentiation. A resolution is nothing other than a sexy binding decision that you decide to put in a couple pieces of paper. You know, a board makes a binding decision and it's reflected in the minutes, or it's reflected in a resolution that you pay someone to draft. It doesn't change the nature of the decision, doesn't make one decision more enforceable than the other. And in fact, arguably under these new regulations, doing a resolution seems like even more of a waste of money and time, because it still has to be in the minutes. So you'd have to have a meeting in which time the board votes on what's in your resolution, and you'd still have to put it in the minutes anyway. So creating a separate piece of paper as a resolution is not, it has no additional legal significance. It doesn't change anything. Does that answer your question?
I have to mute people, Dave, to go to the next person.
You have an ongoing dialogue.
Yeah. Cynthia V has a great question about management companies and ballots. Cynthia B, are you there? Cynthia B. I'm going to ask Cynthia B's question. Electronic ballots permitted only if it's administered by a neutral third party. Is the management company considered a third party?
I'm going to look real quick at the language, because I think the answer is probably, well, as far as the DCA is concerned, the language is probably no. But I think an argument can be made that it is. But I think the language is. I have to look at that more specifically. But I think they might use the word like outside, or there may be some other word besides neutral. But I'd have to look at that more. But I can tell you the DCA won't think that a management company is neutral.
Cynthia, you can just follow up on an email on that, and then I'll connect you with Dave, and we'll get you that.
I can help you with that. I can help you with that.
Also, Tony Z has a question about a lot of questions about, can we get rid of this board member of that? So I want to go to a couple of these. Tanya Z, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hi. Yeah, so my question was, if a board member is currently delinquent, what actions can be taken to either notify that board member that they are delinquent, and do we have that ability to do that, or would that be a just cause for a board to remove that member?
Well, it's even easier than that. Even before these regulations, although these regulations make it easier, an absolute qualification for service on the board is being in good standing. So a trustee, a board member that's not current in his or her assessments is not in good standing under the statute and the regulations, and therefore they're automatically disqualified.
Gary R, I'm just going to ask his questions. I presume you did not make it clear that most board votes on removal need to be only a majority vote. Is there any language in regard to that, Dave?
Good question. It's a majority. Yeah.
A lot of comments about the disappointment and how hard it's going to be to facilitate some of these open meetings. How does this is from Donna B. I'm going to just ask you, how does the public tallying of votes apply to an uncontested election?
That's a good question. As far as DCA is concerned, it wouldn't change anything. You'd still have to count them, because I guess the DCA would argue there's no guarantee that people didn't write. I mean, the other issue here is there's now a mandate for associations that are more than 50 units that you have to provide for write-in candidates, which was something that I felt, and I think most of my colleagues felt, had been eliminated by the Radburn Amendments, quite happily eliminated, and that write-ins were not only not appropriate, but were actually forbidden by virtue of the Radburn Amendments. These regulations now require that write-in spaces be made available for associations that are 50 plus units. So in that regard, Donna B, the answer would be it wouldn't change anything because theoretically there's no such thing as an uncontested election if you're required to have write-in. If you're required to have space for write-in candidates, there's, I guess, theoretically no such thing as an uncontested election until you open the ballot.
Denise B, you have a great question. I'm going to go to you next after I read this one, Denise B, about double envelopes. A question from Olin or Eileen. Can trustees be held liable individually if found in violation of the Radburn regs? If so, will D&O cover them? Maybe that's an insurance question.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I've seen it. I've talked to a couple of people about this. I don't think the regulations create any mechanism by which individual board members could be individually penalized. So I don't know where that sort of comes from, but I guess some people have talked about that. But the specific language of the regulation references the ability of the DCA to impose fines and penalties consistent with other parts of the section, which applies only to associations. Like the DCA is allowed to penalize an association for failing to have the correct minutes, let's say. But the requirement to have the correct minutes is not a requirement that's imposed on individual people. It's imposed upon the association. So therefore, I don't see how under these regulations, I've done some research already on them, and even to the extent of trying to consider what the definition of person is. I mean, a lot of different lawyer kind of things involved with this, but I just don't think there's a mechanism by which the DCA could penalize individual board members or one board member because the board didn't have the right spelling in the minutes, or because the board's notice of a board meeting was 6 days instead of 7. I don't think the regulations, even as they're written, contemplate individual people on boards being penalized in any way. So I don't think that's even a possibility, although God only knows what the DCA will think. But in terms of coverage and D&O, I can't say. You'd have to talk to an insurance professional about that. But I will say that in terms of indemnification by the corporation, there's two separate things. A board member can be sued for something and can be entitled to an insurance defense. But even aside from that, they're entitled to a defense and indemnification from the corporation itself. And under the current Nonprofit Corporation Act language, the board an association is pretty much required to defend a board member that's accused of something until it's over, and then only if there's some determination that the board member really, did something really bad. So again, I don't think there's any language here that would allow the DCA to penalize individual board members. And even if there was language, I don't see how anything that you could be guilty of under these regulations would allow an association not to defend you and indemnify you. I mean, the regulations don't address really bad things like illegal discrimination or stealing or anything like that. It's about function and practice, and there's no violation here pretty much that would seem to ever rise to the level of something that an association couldn't defend a board member for.
And just so everyone out there knows, we always kind of consider this an overtime segment. We just kind of relax a little bit. We have the audience ask a lot of questions. We did hit most of our talking points already. We are going to have follow-up materials. And I think, like I said, we're going to break these down into categories so they're a little bit more digestible. And those follow-up materials are going to include a lot of the questions that you're asking. Denise B, are you there?
I'm here.
Great. Can you ask your question, Denise? Thank you for asking it.
Sure. With the double envelope system, how is that going to work for associations that accept ballots via email or fax, as well as proxies?
Those are good questions. I'm not really sure how that's going to work.
So in your estimation, I'm sorry, but in your estimation, I'm pretty sure that we're probably going to have no less than a dozen more seminars on each one of these sections, because we just got used to the old Radburn. Now we're getting used to the new Radburn. I see it just being it's very not cost effective with this new plan.
Oh, I think there's I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think you're totally right about that. and I think that on a variety of different levels, including the fact that these regulations make it almost impossible. And this is why Ray made that comment before about lawyers, but it also applies, I think, to managing agents. It's almost impossible for an association to have a meeting or an election or do any of the things that are covered by these regulations without consulting with someone and paying someone to tell you how they think it should be done. And it's a shame because, you know, money can be better, association money can be better spent than making sure, you know, your notice of your board meeting is, you know, the right color and put in the right spot and, you know, done all these things, especially when most people probably won't come anyway. It's kind of a silly thing, but yeah, I agree with you. It's difficult, but I hope, I mean, it's just I hope that someone challenges them either collectively or individually. I hope that some associations have the courage to attempt to withstand any DCA attempt to enforce them and take the right to appeal, take the right to a hearing and try to win and try to show that these rules are either inappropriate, illegal, unconstitutional, that they're not interpreted correctly. I hope that somebody pushes back and maybe that's how there'll be relief. But as of now, you know, they're there and your lawyers or your managing agents will have to try to come up with ways to deal with them, either to deal with them straight up or maybe have strategies to get around them or strategies to interpret them differently. It'll all be based on what level of risk a board is prepared to take or have.
And I'm going to go to Barbara D. Donna B next, by the way, if you could just be about, you had some questions about board's requirement clause, but I'm going to ask Susan's question first. Is an annual calendar with meeting dates sufficient notice of board meetings? Can you expand on that, Dave?
Yes, it is. But there also is a requirement that the notice still be done individually. So the language is that you have to, after the annual meeting, you have to post the schedule. But then you still have to give notice to all members of every board meeting. So posting the schedule, the way I see it, in relation to the old regulations, no longer gives the board the freedom of not giving other notice. That's one of the reasons why. That was one of the good reasons why an association would do an annual schedule, because it did give you the argument that you didn't have to give other notices. That doesn't apply anymore. You still have to give other notices anyway. The annual schedule now is not a benefit to you, but a burden, because if you change the date on the schedule, you have to then renotice the whole thing. So it's now not something that's a positive and will help an association be more efficient in governance. It's now something that will be an additional burden that if you then change the meeting in October that you scheduled in January, you then have to go through a whole another notice thing.
Donna B, are you there? You have a question about explaining cost. Donna B.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hey, David. I just had a question of what are there any exact definitions on what the board needs to disclose when making decisions at a board meeting as it relates to cost and the definition of the work?
No, nothing specific in the regulation other than the basis for the decision and then the basis for the cost, then the cost. Basis for and cost, I think is the word. I can look it up specifically. I think the language is specifically basis and cost. So no, nothing specific.
Jacqueline's question is, and maybe we misrepresented it because in providing members the opportunity to talk at board meetings, that amendment was talking about board members, right, Dave? Not residents?
Board members.
Okay. So that was in regard, Jacqueline, to board members. But let me ask your question anyway. In providing members the opportunity to talk at board meetings, this needs to be recorded in the minutes. Then it must be during the meeting and not after adjournment during public comments.
No, there's no requirement that when you say members, if you mean owners, then there's no mandate that owners be given the chance to talk. That hasn't changed. And in fact, to the extent the language of the regulations even addresses owner participation, it says, I think, only that owners can be given the right to participate. Then nothing's changed. Owners have no right to participate. They have the right to be there and watch, but they have no right to participate. But if you do, the new regulations do make it clear that if you do allow owners to participate, you have to be fair and non-discriminatory in how you do it, which is probably how all of us operated anyway. That was probably unnecessary. There's no requirement that you allow people to talk. The provision I read before was about the requirement that board members be given equal opportunities to participate.
Dave, a question from Dave. Are public board meetings required when the board makes binding decisions regarding employment issues? We're back
Yes.
to these confidential issues.
Based on the regulations, every decision you make, everyone, has to be made at a meeting that's open to attendance of owners.
But you don't
So
need to.
there's no exceptions. The only way around this, or the only way to deal with it in a reasonable, efficient way, is to attempt to limit the number of binding decisions you have to make. So that's why we talked earlier about a decision to pay the pool company its August payment. Now, that's a decision that is a binding decision the board has to make. But if that is a payment that's consistent with the budget, or it's consistent with the contract that the board previously made by virtue of a binding decision, then my argument will be it's unnecessary to make another binding decision to send the check or to decide to pay. So there's no exception under these regulations for anything. The only mechanism, the only way to deal with it is to try to attempt to take the position that everything is not a binding decision, or not everything requires a binding decision. That's one strategy. There are a couple of other strategies that I think I've thought about as well. Hopefully maybe we'll get a chance to play out as to how to deal with this, because it is I think it's almost impossible to interpret these regulations literally and prohibit a board from making any decision unless it's at a board meeting open to attendance of owners after it's given 7 days notice. Seems kind of ridiculous. So I don't think it's possible. There have to be strategies available to make that doable.
Dave, in regard to like an employment issue, though, the board isn't required to discuss the details of what's going on. They just basically have to have the vote in front of the membership,
Correct.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, how vague can they leave it? Say, we're voting on item, I'm being ridiculous. We're voting on item 3, employment issue. Hey.
How vague can you leave it? As vague as you are prepared to accept the risk a DCA will do something. I mean, if it's all sort of like on a case-by-case basis. You guys all know, whoever's still participating and listening, you know, when you're in a community where there are owners who are complaining about things and who file DCA complaints and who are pains. Sometimes they have a good reason to be, sometimes they don't. If you're in one of those communities, and you're about to fire your concierge guy, and he's the most beloved guy in the building, and everyone loves him, but you need to fire him because you need to fire him. How much information you have to give? The decision to fire him might generate a complaint to DCA. And if you think that's going to happen, then the more information you provide, the more likely it is DCA will not fine you. Because the information, DCA's job is not to decide whether you should or should not fire the concierge. It would be simply whether or not you fire them with the right procedure. So if you're in a community that's firing a concierge and no one cares, then I don't know that you need a lot of information at all. But again, the board and management are going to have to go into the community where they are, and they're going to have to respect the dynamic that's available and make decisions based on the facts on the ground. And some communities require a lot of information because people complain, and some communities don't. But there's no barometer. The regulations don't say you must have 3 sentences or 2 sentences, or you must, have this information or that. It just says basis for the decision and costs. I mean, that's as vague as it gets. And the DCA probably likes it that way because that gives the DCA the ability to claim that something's not sufficient.
These new regulations, they're active right now. They were approved last week, right? Dave, people are asking.
Theoretically active now, yeah. Yeah. And you made the point earlier about COVID. I mean, that perhaps provides an avenue for a board to be more cautious, and when it begins to put these regulations into place, perhaps I can make an argument on behalf of a client to that effect, probably, if I had to. So that might be an avenue that you can use. But technically speaking, they're there. So if tomorrow the board wants to vote to, I don't know, do something it hadn't already voted on, I don't know, hire, I don't know, fix a portion of the clubhouse roof for $4,000. You can't have a vote on email and decide to do it and start the work tomorrow, unless the roof's about to fall in which case, but otherwise you couldn't. You'll have to wait until you have the next board meeting that's open to intensive owners.
Trish E, are you there? Your question is perfect right now. Trish E.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I've had boards in the past that allow a threshold for the manager to make decisions to, say, make a roof repair, say up to $2,000. If the association allows managers to make a decision up to the threshold, will that help eliminate all these meetings for decisions made?
Yes, in my view, the answer is yes. And I think it's a really good point and a good question, and connects with some of the things we've talked about earlier, which are that if a board is deciding ahead of time, board makes a binding decision to sign a management contract. And in that management contract, the management company is empowered to make certain decisions, right? The binding decision about those decisions has already been made. It was the binding decision to hire the management company. It would seem ridiculous to suggest, although the DCA might very well do this, but it would seem ridiculous to suggest that if my board votes on a contract in which the management company is empowered to do things up to $2,000 without vote, it would seem ridiculous then to require my board to vote to spend $1,000 on what the management company wants to do, because I already voted on that. With my dog again.
Okay, great.
All right, well, I think we're going to leave it at that. I'm going to go through a lot of these additional questions with Dave and see what we can put together for down the road, whether an email or we'll get Dave back. I wanted to thank everybody. Once again, I did send Dave's email address out. He's giving away 4 $25 gift cards. We're happy to send you Association Help Now books. We have a construction effect live stream on Thursday. Join us for that. It's for 1CU. Once again, Dave Byrne, Ansel Grimm and Aaron, thank you so much. These were kind of new and tough ones, right? Don't really know where
It was good. I mean, good topics. A lot to talk about. Hopefully it was helpful.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Sorry.